This is ICASTnews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City. And this is heat in the Middle East. Fierce, fighting, fearsome, frustrating. And despite, or perhaps because of a pause ordered by the Kremlin in the fighting, there is an incredible order of battle being thrown at eastern Aleppo, and the entire city is haunted by fear and fearsome battling. In the last 24 hours, a humanitarian evacuation has begun to take place. Men and women being able, for the first time in 4.5 years, to reunite with their friends, family, and comrades in the western side of Aleppo are on the move. Men being carried on stretchers because there is nothing except for first aid in eastern Aleppo, as all the hospitals have been bombed, are moving to the western side to get some kind of treatment, some kind of medical assistance. And people are just on the move out of fear, as the walls between the two halves of the city are being battered and bludgeoned down by the army of Bashar al-Assad. People are moving west for the first time. The city has been divided for 4 years, with the rebels holding the east and the regime loyal to strongman Bashar al-Assad, now backed by Iran and by Russia, holding the west. But in a blitzkrieg of war in this past week, there has been a significant change. The blitzkrieg has taken neighborhoods apart and given more control over the city to forces loyal to Bashar al-Assad. In doing so, we see one picture sent out by Twitter, a man who shows my home, my neighborhood, destroyed as never before, unimaginable. If we look at the map now shows the divided city with between 75 and 85% of the territory now controlled by troops and forces loyal to the Syrian government. We can't be more precise than that, because there is a fog kicked up by the destruction brought by barrel bombs dropped by helicopters, artillery battering the city. And now, take a look at this. Look at this. There are tanks, Russian-made tanks, going into the old part of the so-called citadel in the center, eastern center of Aleppo. They are battering and bludgeoning their way through the city and taking no prisoners, crushing everything in their path. This week, in the midst of this blitzkrieg war, destruction was said to be on the, well, to be suspended, to pause, as Sergei Lavrov, Thursday night, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, announced that there would be a pause in the fighting to allow some 8,000 men and women to be evacuated through corridors of safe passage out of the eastern part of the city. But reports from the city say that that's not happening. And Stefan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy for Syria, told reporters yesterday at the United Nations that he had no idea if there was a pause in the bombing. He had no idea what the situation on the ground was, and he noted that he thought the end game was close at hand, that victory for the forces of the Syrian government would come between now and Christmas. And even as we think that there's a chance for evacuation, look at this picture of forces of troops loyal to the Syrian government looking out through a window, looking across the battle lines, ready to shoot, ready to fire, ready to bring the war home. And even if they're not bringing the war home, There is very worrisome war news that some of the people who've been evacuated out, there has been a separation of men 30 to 50 years old from women. UN human rights spokesman Rupert Colville said that there are all kinds of reports that they are separating families. Men 30 to 50 are being singled out and have disappeared. And he said, given the record of torture and disappearance, of course the United Nations is deeply, deeply concerned. But they're also concerned with the unrelenting wave of violence with bodies left in the streets. Look at this video. This video came across Twitter from the White Helmets. You get a sense of this week's utter destruction, where bombs and shells are landing. There is nothing approaching hospitals that are functioning. Wounded people, dead people are at best just covered up by those on the streets. There's almost no humanitarian aid going on here. The level of destruction, the level of brutality, the level of inhumanity, Syrian to Syrian, is incredible. Some of this is done with Russian weapons. Some of this is done from Russian-made helicopters with Syrians dropping barrel bombs on their brothers and sisters in eastern Aleppo. And finally, it seems that they are winning the battle. And in this carnage, the United Nations has looked both helpless and hapless. Today at UN headquarters here in New York, the General Assembly took up a resolution. The resolution called for the rapid, safe, sustained, unhindered, and unconditional humanitarian access throughout the country for the United Nations. America's ambassador, Samantha Power, said this vote is a vote to stand up and tell Russia and Assad to stop the carnage. And the General Assembly voted 122 to 13 with 36 abstentions to support that declaration. And the declaration has virtually no impact at all. It is a measure of the pulse and the political sentiment of the General Assembly, but it is non-binding. Non-binding. What would be binding would be a Security Council resolution. But earlier this week, a similar measure was voted down, vetoed in the Security Council by Russia, and interestingly, joining Russia suddenly, China, a little offended at some things America has been saying, back in bed with their Russian allies. Venezuela also voted for that. The situation in Syria is in the world's crosshairs. We see it as a target of concern, a target of fighting, a target that focuses our attention to some of the worst killing since the Second World War. The only glimmer of hope is news late today that tomorrow in Geneva, military experts from the United States, Russia, and Syria will get together and discuss steps that might lead to a pause in the fighting, or at least a way to allow people to be evacuated. The pincer movement of the Syrian government is surrounding and crushing what's left of the opposition, the rebels, some of them backed by the United States and the West. What's going to happen to those people as they leave the city? And the real worry for people who remember Srebrenica, where young men were separated out and then shot dead in trenches by the Serbs. The murder of innocents while the UN did nothing in Srebrenica. That's really what's haunting the fearfulness of this fearful fighting this week. What does it mean that men 30 to 50 are being separated out as they move back west out of East Aleppo as it's being destroyed? It's a worrisome and wearisome and war-torn week in Aleppo, and here at United Nations headquarters as the hapless and helpless UN can seemingly do nothing to stop the devastation and what Samantha Powers called today the carnage. For ICASTnews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City. For Heat in the Middle East, I'm Jonathan Sanders.